This is a book just recently published by a professor of psychology at Harvard named Steven Pinker, a very highly respected figure. It's called The Better Angels of Our Nature: Why Violence Has Declined. It is an interesting argument that he makes, which is that over the long duration of human existence as a species, there has been a steady decrease in the incidence of violence. For the earliest periods, he goes to archaeological sites and looks at the proportion of skeletons that show signs of being killed by violence. As he moves forward in time, he gets into more other sorts of data. But it's a book that is very heavily quantitative, highly theoretical, and designed to provoke a certain amount of skepticism, I think. In other words, I think he's aware that he has to sell this idea of a long-term decline in violence, partly because it comes to center eventually on the question of whether the 20th century was a particularly violent time. 40 million, I think, is the number he gives. So I want to talk about the types of arguments that get involved here, because they're directly relevant not just to the whole question of World Wars I and II, but to what he refers to as the long peace, that is to say, history of Europe since 1945. The argument there is over whether the 20th century was in a long-term trend, a time of low violence that happened to have some anomalies, namely World War I and World War II, and that the long peace is the natural continuator. That is to say that in the future there will be few wars that are even remotely comparable in terms of loss of life with the ones we've seen in the past. Or whether there are, one has to regard World Wars I and II as being really, really, really bad, wars that killed a lot of people, and we see no reason why that should be the end of it. Going back to the World War I slogan of a war to end all wars. Is there any reason to think that war is finished, and that when we look at the second half of the 20th century, we should see it not as a post-war era in the sense of being post-World War II, but a post-war era in the sense of wars being now diminished in their significance?
Niall Ferguson quoted, Folk of Ergon, quoting Niall Ferguson, asserts that more people have been killed since the end of World War II than before in the 20th century. Violently killed.
One of the virtues of Pinker's approach from his point of view is that he focuses overwhelmingly on Europe, whereas the Rwanda, Holocaust, and other really regrettable events are not European and don't fall into the category of war in the fashion that he's talking about it. But let me give a little bit of the way he constructs this, and some of the things that are pertinent to it. He is a Hobbesian, as far as I can tell. I have not read the entire book. I've gone into it here and there. But it's clearly he is a believer that Thomas Hobbes was right, and that in the primitive state of mankind, you had a war of all against all. That warfare was the common experience, and that the corollary, of course, is that states reduce the probability of war, or the lethality of war. This is a highly debated issue among anthropologists, and partly because the archaeological record is ambiguous. That is to say, you don't have all of the skeletons, you don't have necessarily a very clear notion of the time period over which violent deaths occurred. You simply don't have a context. Simply you have skeletons that show signs of death by violence. And when you come to the foraging period of human existence, which has both the archaeological component and the modern ethnographic component, where people have observed societies and made appraisals of how violent those societies are, there you get some substantial debates. Probably the best known debate deals with an Amazon tribe, namely Yanomamo. They were studied by an anthropologist named Napoleon Chagnon, and he portrays them as being continually at war. His book on the Yanomamo came out in the 60s and became the best-selling and widely used book in anthropology. And in almost any book you read about the history of warfare, chapter 1 will deal with, nowadays, with the Yanomamo, because they're taken as being a pre-contact foraging, pre-contact meaning pre-European association, foraging culture that engaged in continuous and particularly lethal warfare. Chagnon describes them as being, as not fighting for food or territory, but for women. He quotes one of the chiefs as saying, we like meat, but we like women more. And then he argued that the chief, the victors, ended up having more children than the vanquished. And therefore it became a sort of a Darwinian thing, where warfare was a way of ensuring that your DNA would be passed on. And for people who are oriented towards sociobiology, this suggests sort of a continuum between chimpanzee behavior, though not bonobo behavior, and human behavior. Now, there have been half a dozen anthropologists who have subsequently written about Yanomamo warfare, all of them disagreeing in one way or another along different lines with Chagnon. And Chagnon has been barred from ever going back to Yanomamo territory by the Catholic missionaries who now have authority over the territory, and they have written their own appraisals of the Yanomamo. It is very contentious. Descriptions of meetings where this comes up seem to include people screaming and shouting and calling one another liars and Nazis and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that there are other descriptions of, in the ethnographic literature, of other foraging societies that have high rates of warfare, or at least of death by violence. The question, in a sense, is, and it's always a question when you use ethnography as a stand-in for archaeology, is whether a foraging group observed in the 20th century is behaving the same, or at least in general or analogously, in the way a foraging group of 40,000 years ago would have behaved. And one of the indicators that this may not be the most reliable thing to go on is the fact that there aren't many foragers left. You might say that, you could argue perhaps that all the peaceful foragers settled down and bought stock and, now live off their proceeds, and it's only the really violent ones that are left. Probably not true, but I mean, there has to be some cognizance taken of the fact that the surviving societies are in many cases, some of the most inhospitable environments and most challenging environments. So it's not very clear, but of course there are certain things that are that you also have to take into account. If you have a dispute where there is no state, where there is no law, what do you do other than kill the other guy? There's no prison. There's no no system of fines because there's no monetary system. And to some degree, you could argue that killing takes place because it's the only alternative. You don't have other ways to sanction other people. There are, of course, other ways to look at it. For example, you could say you could exile someone, as we know happens in early state formations and to some degree in some anthropological contexts. But some of the violence may come about simply because that's the only recourse you have. Then you get into the issue of states, and Pinker moves in fairly quickly into the notion of Europe, and particularly focuses on statistics that were gathered first by Ted Gurr and then by others, indicating that between 1400 and say 1900, the rate of homicide in England fell by orders of magnitude. It has to be displayed on a logarithmic scale, because you'd have like 100 people per 100,000 per year being killed by homicide, and in 1400, and you're down to like 5 by the time you got to 1900. And there are similar curves, not quite as dramatic, for other European countries. So the argument is that violence, as measured by homicide, declines. That doesn't mean that war necessarily declines, but rather homicide in terms of individuals killing other individuals. And again, you have the issue of what the alternatives are. That if you're going to have a punitive regime, what can you do other than kill someone? Eventually you get prisons. eventually you get other sorts of punishments, like sending someone to Australia or something like that. But presumably there's a time where death or dismemberment were the only real sanctions that you had. And that's not too hard to understand. So institutionally, I think one can see why homicide per se would perhaps diminish. But Pinker moves in a different direction, and he relies very heavily on the thinking of a sociologist named Norbert Elias, a German sociologist who fled Germany as a Jew with the rise of Nazism, and settled in England, where he had a whole variety of kind of adjunct type teaching jobs. Never became a particular star, and indeed was not even noticed very much until the last 10 years or so of his life. He died, I believe, in 1990. The book that has given him fame now is called The Civilizing Process. And he wrote it in 1939, a bad year to write about the civilizing process. It was, not surprisingly, ignored until it was translated into English in 1969. Then, in sort of a meteoric fashion, Elias became one of the giants of sociology who had been overlooked a little bit in the way that Max Weber got adopted at an earlier point, or that Herbert Spencer got vilified at a certain point. But Elias sought to explain why violence vanished in Europe over a period of 600 or 700 years. And I'm here talking about not about warfare per se, but about propensities to engage in violent activity. The civilizing process for him uses the notion of civilized that you have in sort of Italian civiltà, the idea that a civilized person is a cultured person, is a person who has adopted the manners and inculcated the mental outlook of being a civilized being. So he's interested in things like table manners, standards of personal behavior. You know, do you act abusively, or is it considered wrong to do so? And he sort of tries to chart these over a period of centuries to see that the Europeans became less and less barbaric, to use a somewhat loaded term, over that period of centuries. In his last book, which this last book published during his lifetime, which was a study translated in English as The Germans, it was a study of his fellow countrymen. He focuses very heavily on dueling and on the disappearance of dueling. Says that dueling becomes kind of a benchmark of where the society stands with respect to resort to violence. And he faults Germany for being very late in outlawing dueling compared with other European countries. And it's a book full of details about dueling. For Pinker, what Elias suggests is that some major transformation in European society led to a diminishment of violence over a period of centuries. So that raises a question of what the change was in European society. Elias suggests that it's the move from feudal life to more centralized state life. Then you get to the Enlightenment and to the rise, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, of notions of humane behavior, and so forth and so on. So in a sense, the diminishment of violence is seen as a consequence of the whole master narrative of Western European history that has been traditional in courses on Western civilization. In other words, it isn't simply Western civilization as a place, but it's Western civilization as a way of life. So Pinker runs the risk here of coming up with a theory that, although buttressed by enormous amounts of statistical or at least quantified information, coming up with a theory that basically says Europe is really wonderful, and so let's not talk about the rest of the world, because he has a hard time talking about the rest of the world. The quantification has not been done. The primary sources are not readily available. When he has a list that he picks up from some other researcher of the 20 worst villainies perpetrated by humans against other humans, he lists among the top 20 is number of lives lost through Middle East slave trading, and something like 15 million more lives lost through slave trading in the Middle East than are lost through slave trading in the Atlantic, according to this list. I have never run across any statistics that would even remotely support this idea. What it results from, I'm pretty sure, is some travelers' observations in the 19th century, particularly Henrik Barth, who traveled extensively in the Sahara and witnessed slave caravans moving from Chad, Mali, Niger, northward across the Sahara. A lot of human life was lost because of the difficulty of the passage, and a lot of people were presumably killed in some other fashion. I don't know exactly how. I don't see why slave trading would promote killing, particularly when North Africa, the destination, did not have sugar plantations or other types of farming economy that tended to be lethal to slaves. But nevertheless, I think what happened was that somebody took this sort of observation and simply multiplied it by the number of years that they might plausibly think there had been Saharan trade. The multiplier that Pinker refers to is, I think, can't remember, it's about 1,000 years or so, or 1,500. Anyway, it goes well before Islam. As if we can simply take an account from the 19th century and simply extrapolate and come up with a number, which we will then put on a chart that will then be digested by a psychologist and say, this tells you something. Similarly, with the 40 million people killed in the Mongol conquests, he mentions 1.5 million killed in the city of Merv. City of Merv is an oasis in the Karakum Desert, that has never had 1.5 million inhabitants, may have had a couple of 100,000. I doubt they were all killed, but he takes all the numbers from Persian chronicles that were designed to create horror feelings about the Mongols. So the problem with fundamentally someone who aggregates aggregations that are made up of other things aggregated, I mean, whatever your fundamental error is, it essentially gets multiplied. So when it comes to the non-European data, I'm extremely skeptical of Pinker's finding. I also find it very interesting that if you compare, say, 1400 in the Islamic world with 1900, and you look at the rate of homicide, that is to say murders and such, or even at the rate of warfare, you'll find that the Muslim world was extremely peaceful. Homicide was not a particularly common crime. You go down even to interwar years in Iraq in the 20th century, statistically the most common crime was verbal abuse, which, you know, if you say to someone in public, your father is a dog, you can be imprisoned because that's abusive. But the idea that people killed each other in a commonplace fashion, I've never found any evidence that occurs. And when I look at the European statistics, what I'm struck by is not how wonderful the Europeans were at becoming more peaceful, but how barbaric they were at the start of their curve, because in the end they become more or less peaceful. Except, of course, for World War I and World War II. So there are lots of suspicious elements here. But a lot of the agenda that Pinker has works backwards from the business of the long peace, and whether we are now in an era that is truly post-war or whether it is something else. In order to argue that, he has to first explain away World War I and World War II, and secondly, he has to explain why the long peace has come to pass, which he clearly believes it has. Explaining away World War I and II. Says there are some people who have argued that wars have gotten worse and worse, that there's been sort of a step function, that you had wars that killed 2 million, then up to 5, up to 10, up to 30, up to 40, and he cites Arnold Toynbee as someone who says wars have gotten worse and worse. Then he cites other people who say that wars are cyclical, and that after a period of peace there is a propensity for war that grows and war recurs. He argues that when you look at very large collections of war data, and here he's aggregating what other people have aggregated without particularly inquiring as to the nature of each war. He says what you have is a Poisson distribution, which indicates randomness. That, yeah, wars occur, but they don't occur cyclically. They don't occur in a step function in terms of increasing violence. And they are not the instance of one war, should never be taken to be an indicator of the next war any more than you would take a flip of the coin of heads to indicate that tails is coming up next. So he says that World War I and World War II were truly awful, but they were random. How does he account for the fact that they occurred when they occurred? And here he refers to counter-Enlightenment romanticisms like Nazism and communism. And the notion of counter-Enlightenment is very important for him. The Enlightenment, as he sees it, is a movement of rationality and systematic effort, philosophically and morally based, to discover the truth about everything. Romanticism takes you out of the world of calculus and careful philosophical rule making, and into the world of feeling. And many people have noted that the rise of Romanticism at the turn of the 19th century is a counterpoint to the Enlightenment rationalism of the 18th century. But he sees the isms that arise as being isms that are empowered by the desire or the lure of connecting with something that is super rational, super individual, whether that something is the working class or the state, the nation, or the party, or whatever you have. So he finds that World War I and World War II arise from the propagation of these counter Enlightenment movements, and that these burned themselves out. You know, they evoked passions, evoked willingness to sacrifice, but eventually it was all blood on the battlefield, and that is more or less over, sort of the end of ideology idea. So then he goes back and makes reference to a paper written by Immanuel Kant called Perpetual Peace, where Kant adumbrates the thought that some sort of world government, or at least, if not a formal world government, at least some sort of internationalist interact and cooperation could lay the groundwork for perpetual peace. And this leads him to one of the great discoveries or inventions, it's hard to tell which, of the political science profession, which is the idea of the democratic peace. If you go into political science, you will be exposed to this repeatedly by people working in international relations, so not all of them. And this maintains that if you make a list of all wars over the last, say, 300 years, that there's no instance of a democratic country going to war with another democratic country. Except the War of 1812, but we won't count that, because we can call that kind of a late colonial war or something. And says, you know, it is so improbable that you would have no wars between democracies that perhaps we have here a law that democracies do not go to war except with autocracies or other vile, horrible people who deserve a good thrashing.
How many democracies were there before 1900?
One might ask how many democracies there were before 1900, and that would be the responsibility of the aggregator, not of the person who's spinning off conclusions. But you also have the problem, and this has been a fairly recent refinement, as to whether the democratic peace applies to democratizing countries as opposed to democratic countries. So in other words, if Russia goes to war with Georgia, is that a democracy going to war with another democracy? Or is Georgia in the category of a democratizing country? As maybe we were in 1812, who knows? And do you have to cut fledgling democracies a little bit of slack because they haven't yet studied political science and learned that they are not supposed to go to war? So Pinker says, well, let's take that as a sort of working hypothesis, that as the world democratizes, wars will become obsolete. Now let's add to it the question of what is the relationship between war and international trade? Do countries that have trading relationships go to war with one another? Well, of course they do, but not with great frequency, it seems. And the volume of trade seems to be counterindicated. In other words, do you go to war with Iran when it's going to totally screw up the entire world oil market? Well, maybe you do. We'll probably know by the end of next semester. But there's an argument to be made that there are going to be people in both countries that will stop this. And part of it will be, a major part of it will be the fact that Iran produces so much oil that the world cannot really do without it for a prolonged period of time without total chaos and disruption. So Pinker would say that, so you have trade and democracy tend to act against the propensity for war. And then he says the third one is participation in interstate governmental organizations. That if you belong to the World Postal Union or the International Olympic Committee or whatever, you're less likely to go to war because you're in useful contact and so forth and so on. So he builds up this idea. And he raises the question of, is the long peace truly the Kantian state of perpetual peace that was visualized in the 18th century? Now, this book has been very highly praised in reviews of it. I find an enormous number of holes in it, but it's also extremely interesting reading for the bits of data that it brings up and for the other studies it brings together. It seems to me, however, that when it comes to explaining the 20th century, it really doesn't work. That, saying, it's just kind of a random, anomalous thing that if Gavrilo had not assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, there wouldn't have been a First World War, so there wouldn't have been a Great Depression, so there wouldn't have been a Second World War, and it's his fault. And he wasn't executed. He was a minor. He was put in prison and died several years later, but of the natural causes that are so common in prisons, I think. So I have a hard time accepting the hypothesis that we are now embarked on a perpetual peace that is intrinsic to the achievement of the Enlightenment. What Pinker is doing here in part is countering a fairly long series of attacks on the Enlightenment. You may start with Nietzsche. You can certainly add in Foucault. You can add in any number of people who have said that that the sort of self-congratulatory scientism and worship of rationality in the Enlightenment actually led to bad things as well as good things, and it was not necessarily the greatest triumph of human thought and human moral achievement. And Pinker seems to be terribly desirous to see Europe since 1945 as not only the model for the future that other parts of the world may slowly come to emulate, but also as the great triumph of Western civilization in the long course of history. In this respect, even though the title of the book, the topic of the book, Why Violence Has Declined, seems radical, the book in many ways I think is very conservative in sort of defending what we long thought was the great central achievement of Western civilization. But my objections to this approach are not simply the ones I've stated, but they also, I'm very troubled by the assumption that agency, that is to say the actors, the people who bring about wars, are strictly governments. It's partly because as a social historian and as someone who really believes in that history is made by people and not by forces or events. They coerce people in certain ways, but people are necessary. The people who commit violence, according to Pinker, are males between 15 and 30. So some of you are kind of off the hook. Others maybe not quite. And I think everybody would more or less agree that that's the case. And so you get to the question of what would mitigate that sort of thing. Men behaving badly. And there are certain things that statistically are identified as mitigators. For example, the homicide rate and also the rate of killing and warfare of married men is lower than of single men. Partly because conscription will often exempt married men, and partly because married men have something to live for and they don't want to get shot up. So Pinker would suggest that, where you have a high rate of marriage, you'll have less violence. He doesn't connect it directly with war. He also observes, as many other people have observed, that the sex ratio is a key factor. That when you have males outnumbering females in the youth category, that the probability of there being war is much higher. Presumably because the number of men who cannot find a spouse is substantial enough that they become, wild, crazy, meth snorting, killers of one sort or another. And there's been some effort to actually substantiate this, where we have records dealing with sex ratios. One thing that Pinker points out is that if there is to be war in the future, it may be that the highest probability participants will be those in countries that have high youth populations and a skewed sex ratio. Basically China and India, where you have selective abortion or a preference for male children, and where the female population becomes scarce. But a youth bulge altogether is means that you have more youthful males hanging around than is good for you. So, what do you do about youthful males? Well, yes, that's why we have wars. You kill them. You can't live with them, so let's kill them off.
You have a volunteer army.
If you have a volunteer army, in the first place, the volunteer army is often not as youthful as the conscript army, but it just means that you have a lot of youthful males hanging around. And when I look at the 20th century, which is the notional topic of this lecture, one of the things I'm struck by is that in the first half of the 20th century, the enormous prevalence of uniforms, of not simply men in uniform, but boys in uniform, women in uniform. The idea, well, for example, the Boy Scouts started in 1910, Baden-Powell, a British general who had fought in the Boer War in South Africa and who was creating a youth organization. The Boy Scouts spread phenomenally. Not to every country in the world, but say by the late 20s, you had 30 or 40 countries that had scout movements. The scout movements had uniforms, they had flags, they had ideologies. They usually had a passionate association with their national identity. The notion of a uniform spread surprisingly, so that, say, the new fashions for women in China in the after 1911, many of the new costumes are based on uniforms. Bright colors in women's clothes disappear, and you get drab colors, brown and so forth. And certainly for men, who in 1900 in China had worn, enormously decorative silk brocades. By the 1930s, the stylish men are wearing, the sort of dull-looking clothes that I wear. It is creating a kind of image that is not military, but not that far from military. When I say not that far from military, I'm thinking of someone like William Randolph Hearst, the great newspaper publisher, propagandist for the Spanish-American War, who started his own scout group called the American Boy Scouts, as opposed to the Boy Scouts of America, which he identified as strictly a military organization. It was where boys would learn to be soldiers. Now, of course, they would also learn to be little Native Americans, because the idea that you were learning how to scout, to build campfires, to live rough and so forth, that was a major part of it. But the uniform, the flag, the discipline, the marching in step, the collective swearing of allegiances and oaths and so forth, I think has an influence in orienting those male youth toward what breaks out in war. Now remember, this is at a time in the early 20th century where very few people went to college. And the role that colleges now play as sort of holding pens for young males. After they get out of high school, they don't want to live at home, so they go to college, and then they can do, a certain amount of badass stuff, but it won't be really destructive. And you go say they look at the history of college sports in America. It was deliberately constructed after the Civil War as an outlet for the energies that had led to the Civil War. So that people who were promoting football in the 1870s, 1880s were really thought, we'll get this out of their systems. Because young men who can't find a sex partner, and of course they couldn't find a sex partner, what choice do they have? They could masturbate, that would make them crazy, and so that was prohibited. They could become gay, but that would mean you'd have a whole country full of sissies, and that was prohibited. Or they could fight. And they could fight on a battlefield, or they could fight on a football field. But it was felt that this is what young men are like. There's a lot of truth to that, I think, but it's doesn't mean that it's always regulated in the same fashion. So when you look at that period, down to the end of World War II and perhaps a bit later, you find not just the Boy Scouts, but also the Hitler Jugend, the young pioneers in the Soviet Union. The mobilization of youth is a great phenomenon of the early 20th century. And indeed, the notion of youth culture, almost impossible to find it exemplified prior to the early 20th century. This is when sports arise. Now baseball, which is so slow that it's hard to quite compare it with other sports, that's earlier, but the big team sports and the association of sports, particularly with college education, comes in the 20th century, plus the professionalization of sports, and the creation of the modern Olympics. So between youth movements and sports activities, the idea that young men are being taken in hand by society in new ways, I think is, you can easily argue that. And that as they are taken in hand in new ways, the ways available to them are open to regimentation, indoctrination, and strenuous or indeed violent activity. And you can find this pretty much all over the world. You had there are various proto-fascist, usually when they're not Boy Scouts, we call them proto-fascist, but there are various sort of proto-fascist youth groups in other countries in the early 20th century. And you could look up the dates for the creation of ministries of youth and ministries of sports. They would all fall into this general period. So there was I don't want to overuse the word revolution, but there was certainly a profound change in the institutional forms for socializing young males in the first half of the 20th century, the bad half of the 20th century. This is also when youth fiction comes to be recognized, as opposed to children's books. Children's books go back to the 18th century. But the idea of books aimed at adolescents is something of the early 20th century. And there you get the idea of the young male as an adventurer. This is the Tom Swift books, the Radio Boys books, eventually the Hardy Boys. I mean, these, rubber stamp, terrible novels that came out by the score and that boys gobbled up. But of course, society was also gobbling up crime fiction, which is another, it's more of a perennial, but it was more for adults than for boys. But they eventually come together in the invention of the comic book in the mid-1930s. I'll put off, I'm going to talk about comics, but not at the moment. Interestingly, there is the role of this kind of fiction generally is not recognized, but in Thomas Pynchon's, not his most recent novel, but the one before the most recent one, is called Against the Day. It's of a book of almost unlimited length. It's a huge book. I haven't, even Pynchon specialists I know haven't read the book. Oh, it's really quite good. But in it, he has characters whom he introduces who are known as the chums of chance, who are exactly like the Radio Boys or something like that. They are fictional characters projected as really living at the turn of the century and traveling around the world in a Zeppelin, boys together having adventures. And he really sort of captures the youth imagination of that era, that there was something special. Or if you, it also brings to mind the modern pentathlon, where the activities you engaged in were supposed to be the activities that you might experience if you were a messenger in the war with the army. You might have to fight one touch épée, you'd have to shoot a gun, you'd have to swim a river, you'd have to ride a horse, you'd have to run and deliver your message, and that was the modern pentathlon. The militarization of sports, not the militarization, it's putting it badly, the intersection between male youth culture, violent activity, and sports and military, I don't think was ever as great as it was in the first half of the 20th century. Because when you go back farther, you find that getting people into the army was often a matter of kidnapping them and beating them up, and then shooting them if they left the front lines. The idea that they would go willingly and enthusiastically into the military was not an issue in the 18th century and not through most of the 19th century, except perhaps for the early French Revolution armies. But by the World War I, as I mentioned last week, people went eagerly to war. Not just the officers, who always want to, do what they're trained to do, but the rank and file as well. So then we get to the question of the long peace and whether something happened after World War II. The Cold War is considered by Pinker to be kind of a triumph. The systematic mechanization of war to kill more and more and more had been ratcheted up, and then when the possibility of killing vastly more arose, it never happened, and that is sort of a triumph. Well, yes, it was, and it still hasn't happened. But I'm more interested in what happened to young men, and whether the world after World War II is different with respect to the socialization of men in the risk-taking, killing age group. Whether there are changes. Perhaps this strikes me because I'm someone who was just starting out my professional career during the Vietnam War era. And the anti-war movement of that time was a very shaping influence for people like me. And of course, there have been anti-war movements before. But anti-war movements in the Vietnam era had very little to do with war exhaustion in terms of human losses. Almost everyone who was in the anti-war movement was not in the war. And most of them did not know anyone who was in the war. The war, as usual, was being fought by people from humbler social classes than those who attended Columbia or Harvard. And yet the passion against the war was profound. Now, part of this was the counterculture desire to get away from uniforms, to get away from regimentation, to go off and live in a commune or smoke dope or play guitar or wear bell-bottom trousers, whatever you're going to do, milk a goat. But the rejection of the sort of regimented life that male youth had had up to that point was pretty pronounced, so that when you had the great youth revolts of 1968, which occurred in Tokyo, in Mexico City, in Paris, in New York, I don't think it was simply a localized phenomenon. I think you had vast dissatisfaction with the way in which society treated young people, and that was manifested in this country in an anti-war movement, but in other countries in an anti-state movement or an anti-university movement or something of that sort, that it wasn't just a question of the Vietnam War. And this brings me back to comic books. Maybe it seemed improbable to you, but in 1970, comic books had begun in the 1930s, or at least superhero comic books, Superman and Batman, in the format whereby they were delivered every week to drugstores, and you had a comic book rack. And you would go in every week, and last week's comics would have been taken away, and the new week's would be put out in the same way that the magazines were. So they were just produced. They were very low quality in production, drawing, and so forth. And then in the 1950s, they fell into a deep slump caused partly by the allegation that the boy sidekicks of superheroes were victims of pedophile superheroes. So that Robin was considered a victim. Green Arrow and Speedy, Speedy, the poor thing. And for fear of congressional regulation, after congressional hearings, comic book industry introduced an industry code that essentially took the violence and the gore and the pretty much everything interesting out of the comic books, and the industry essentially collapsed. It reconstructs itself at the end of the 60s and beginning of the 70s in two forms. One are the counterculture comic books that the hippies liked, that R. Crumb and Fritz the Cat and things like that. But the other was a rebirth of the superhero. And in 1970, DC Comics introduced a new character named Darkseid. Darkseid is currently on the list of the sixth most villainous evil person ever to appear in the comic book universe. You can find that list online, the top 100 villains. Darkseid was a supernatural character. I had quit reading comics by that time. But I found myself in Iran, waiting for a good friend to get leave time so we could go exploring. In the meantime, babysitting for his kids, who had a trunk of comic books. So I read them all. And what I discovered just blew my mind. Superman was no longer omnipotent. Superman could win a battle, but he was always going to lose the war. And even more important, all of the fundamental institutions of society had now been undermined by Darkseid, who worked through all sorts of front organizations and so forth. So the Daily Planet, the newspaper that employed Clark Kent, had been bought up by a television conglomerate, and the head of the conglomerate was an agent of Darkseid. Everywhere you went, major industries, government offices, they were all now corrupted. And the level of the corruption was beyond anything a superhero could do anything about. And it was so evident that the counterculture hatred of the CIA, the US government, the Army, and so forth, had penetrated the comic book industry. I found it was quite fascinating. Same time, Robert Ludlum was writing his sort of paranoid novels for adults. But what was interesting about the comic book industry is that the structure of the industry had changed. They no longer distributed to drugstores, which had no longer had comic book racks, but they sold to comic book stores. And they sold on a different basis from trade press books. In a trade press, you can send, 1,000 copies of a new bestseller, like the One Donkey Solution, to a bookseller, and after 3 weeks, they've sold no copies, and they send them back to the publisher, and they simply pulp the remainder or remainder them, because you had free returns from a trade press. Comic book industry didn't give free returns. If a comic book store bought 4 copies of an issue, then they're stuck with them. And it meant that the industry became very strongly oriented toward demand side thinking. If you couldn't sell it, you didn't buy it. So now you had young males in precisely the age group to fight wars who had their own literature. They were sure nobody but they were reading it, and they were generally right. Had no advertising outside the environment of the comic book store. And the industry was incredibly responsive to the demand side, because the dealers wouldn't stock it if they couldn't sell it. So what happens from then on is that you can look at what are the ideas that are attracting violent males, or potentially violent males, ages 12 to 25. What is it they really, really like to read? Because they now have their private literature. And one of the things you can do is to say, here's what they were reading in 1970, and when they're, say, 15 years old. And You add 20 years, they're 35, and now they've been socialized in that direction. And you can actually trace the evolution of topics in comic books to with a time lag of about 20 years, to the evolution of the outlook of takeover generation of males in our society. And what was so striking was that the suspicion of institutions that you had in the early 70s, that was going into the reading library, the secret reading library of every literate boy in the country, was devastating. It was totally different from what you had with Batman and Superman and Captain Marvel or Captain America or even G.I. Joe of 1950. It was no longer standing up for America, for the American way. It was saying that these superheroes were doing their best in a society in which all the institutions were profoundly corrupt. It was almost antithetical to the idea of going to war for those institutions that you were reading about as being corrupt. As you move along, and I don't have time to go into it, but you can actually trace the change of topics over time and see how they manifest themselves, because eventually, of course, comic books become the primary source of movies because the comic book readers grow up and start to make movies. And they make movies reflecting their views, so that, say, a movie like RoboCop, which is based on the notion of the corruption of the city of Detroit, really made a difference. Now that's become a bit of a cliche, and so we move on to other things. Right now, if you're trying to see where things are going, look at the religious comic books. Not the ones that praise religion, but the ones that see religion as a profound source of corruption. Read the Preacher series or the Pilgrim series or some of the ones like that. It's really quite quite interesting, particularly since some of those are clearly aimed at Baptist boys from Texas who are reading them secretly, to make up for how they feel on Sunday being stuck there at church. So what I think has happened, and I'm taking comic books, but you could multiply this by video games, multiply this by internet activities. The idea that you're ever going to have, in Western society at least, a generation of young men who are really drawn to wearing uniforms and marching together and being represented by a banner and so forth, and therefore mobilizable in a fairly easily conceived fashion for a big war, I think that's gone. I don't think it has to do with democracy. I don't think it has to do with trade. I don't think it has to do with international government organization. I think it has to do with the way in which people are, particularly young men, are socialized, and that it is now different. If you to play a first-person shooter game, it really changes you. My generation, it was Doom and Quake and things like that, but putting you on a battlefield that's an electronic battlefield and allowing you to simply massacre them all, it was kind of cool, but you wouldn't want to do it. And now I've argued in my book on animals, Hunters, Herders, and Hamburgers, that you have a reciprocal relationship between the real world and the world of the imagination. That when we quit killing animals in real life, or at least allowing people to see animals killed in real life. When we quit recognizing animal reproduction, the way everybody in 1900 did. They saw animals slaughtered, they saw animals having intercourse, being born. Now, nobody ever sees an animal other than a pet, and the pet is probably neutered. And you certainly don't see animals being killed. But as that happened, you had a vast increase in the experience of killing and sexuality in the imaginary, that people started seeing on television or movies, but even more on the internet, the things that they did not see in the real world. What this amounts to is that, let's go back to the example of, of sex, for example. The old notion of sex from the early 20th century was that if you are inclined to do it and you are not married, you should either suppress that thought or do it in some sort of secret and non-evil fashion. What you should not do is masturbate. Because what happens when you masturbate is that you imagine sex. Doing it was far better than imagining it. Imagining it was fundamentally wrong because it meant that you had a diseased mind. And you would soon go crazy and probably die. And at the very least, you'd go blind. Because imagining it would be, how could you carry on once you'd imagined such things? So you had these draconian punishments and everything, particularly the Boy Scouts, having to do with masturbation. Then we reach a period of the 1970s when you say, well, let's Skype and take our clothes off and masturbate together. Wouldn't that be fun? Or, let's do it all in the imagination. And that becomes the world of today. The internet world, somebody who has telephone sex never gets pregnant. You cannot mishandle a telephone that badly. But the point is that once you move things into the imagination, then the scaling up becomes unlimited. Sex is just sex. But sex in the imagination can turn into all sorts of things. Or seeing a chicken have its head cut off and squirting blood all over and running around without a head. It's pretty disgusting. But in the imagination, you can have people who are spraying blood all over the place. 1969, the squib is invented so that you can shoot someone in the movies and have the blood squirt out. From then on, we've had more and more blood. And I think that we have moved a tremendous amount of our violence into the imaginary realm and out of the realm of organized socialization. So my inclination is to agree that with respect to the idea of peace being probably with us for a long time, that those societies that have made this transition to a world of the violent imagination rather than the violent reality, and who have put the militarization of male youth aside, or the male youth have put it aside all by themselves, that they're going to have a very hard time conducting substantial warfare. But that doesn't apply to everyone in the world. And when you go back and look now at certain guerrilla organizations or terrorist organizations, what you find is that they still have the old notion of socialization, of bringing the shabab, the boys together, to do something violent. So I think we're in a period of transition where we might hope that we can move into a largely post-violent, post-war era, but that we're not there yet on a world basis. But we may achieve it, just not for the reasons that Steven Pinker puts forward.